Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in Game 3 of our coverage of the 2017 U.S. Chess Championships, and we have a good one today because it's the Battle of the Titans. We have Wesley and Fabiano Caruana, number 2 and 3 ranked player in the world, so it's going to be a good one. We have Wesley playing the white pieces and Fabiano Caruana playing the black pieces. Wesley won his first game and then tied in round 2. He is tied for the lead with 1.5 points coming into this round. Fabiano Caruana has tied his first 2 rounds, so he's going to be looking to at least tie this one, but miraculously can always look for a win. That would be pretty impressive as well. We'll start out with pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, getting into the Rai Lopez, and then knight to f6. So this is the Berlin defense. We've seen more and more Berlin defense over the past couple years at high-level play. Even if you just look as recent as the World Championships between Magnus Carlsen and Sergei Karyakin, we saw the Berlin defense 4 or 5 times in their 12-game match. He played this a ton when he played Vichy Anand. Just something we're seeing more and more common. White usually has 2 options here. They could play with the pawn to d3, or most common, which is what does, is castle on the king side. And then after knight takes on e4, pretty much pawn to d4 is the main move. Most of the time, black is not going down the line of the pawn taking on d4, and then rook over here to e1, pinning down the knight. The knight can't really move right now, so you may see pawn down to d5, trying to protect that. Queen up here takes on d4. It gets into some tricky situations that many times black just doesn't want to have to deal with. So knowing this is going to be difficult to hold on to that material, the most common move from here is knight to d6. Now, white has a few options from here. They decided to go down the lines of the queen swap variation. So bishop takes on c6. Black can actually recapture with his b pawn or his d pawn. Decided to go with the pawn takes on c6 from the d pawn. And then after this pawn exchange, then the queens come off the board. And so, all in all, this is probably the most drawish line in the Berlin defense. Berlin defense typically not known as the most aggressive opening, usually more of reserved, drawish. Over the years, we've seen a little bit of ambition come up from some of the lines, but this one I would say is more of the drawish lines. And it almost seems like when you play this, number 2 versus number 3 in the world, you're kind of looking at each other saying, well, let's not get too carried away. There's a lot of other guys here that we can win against. There's no reason for one of us to lose right now. That's at least how I'm imagining this happening as they're sitting across the board from each other. In this position, white has a little bit better pawn structure, but black does have compensation in that his he has the double bishop pair. His king can't castle, but that doesn't matter too much when your opponent's queen comes off the board. So all in all, I'd say both sides are pretty equal in this position. So it continues with pawn to h3. King here to e8, knight c3. Both sides continue to develop a little bit more. Pawn to h5, so starting to push a little bit on the king side of the board. Black does have the pawn advantage on the queen side, so he's going to look to make sure he dominates on the queen side and just somewhat hold fort over here on the king side. He can't really push too much, but he does want to make sure that he doesn't get overrun by his opponent on the king side. That's really the only weakness that he has right here. It's going to be difficult to really control the center of the board. There's not just tons of pawns here, so both sides can easily just throw all their pieces in the middle of the board. I don't see either side really dominating that piece of the game here. But bishop to g5, getting the dark square bishop involved into the game, opening up the door for his rook here from a1 to come over here d1, control this open file. Later on, he can bring his rook over here to e1 as well, start to push up his e-pawn. A bishop to e6, opening up the door for his own rook to get involved into the action. Rook here to d1 as we talked about. Bishop e7, offering up a trade if he wants to. Not the worst move to go ahead and just exchange right now so your opponent doesn't have double bishop pair. But so decides, I'll go ahead and hold on to my bishop right now. I don't want to concede the draw, if you will. So wants to hold on to some of his material. Pawn here to b3, just protecting this bishop on e6 is attacking the pawn here on a2. So wants to make sure he does have a solid pawn chain on the queen side. Pawn down here to h4. This does, in some ways, kind of lock down black over here on the king side. His knight does need to stay here since the bishop and the knight are attacking the pawn. Also, the rook here on h8 for a while is going to need to hang out and protect this. Not terrible. It does block off some of the moves that, white can really make, trying to get outside of this king structure right here. But all in all, black does need to play a little bit more defensive over here on the king side, as we talked about. Rook to e1, just centralizing that rook. Pawn over here to a5. This is the one thing that black needs to do. He's solidified the defense on the king side and now starts to look over here on the queen side of the board. Rook to d3, preparing for rook to d1, trying to attack this d file. And then just rook over here to d8 says, well, let's just go ahead and put a stop to this. Don't do anything too crazy. We do see an exchange off the board and the knight to e2. And this is interesting. I think rook to d1 is just a lot more straightforward. I'm not exactly sure why he wouldn't do this. You always want to control these long files. Rook here to d1, king c8. We could see the bishop exchange on board. Knight back here to e7. We don't know the exact moves that they would do, but, knight to g5, attacking the bishop and the pawn. We could see an exchange if we wanted to, or just pawn up here to f4, solidifying. I think this is a pretty good position for white, but you never know. There's a lot of these positions that they have computers running tons of analysis, and they may see something, 5 times out of 100 in an Endgame. They really like one position. They think they have an advantage, and it all stems from this move, knight to e2. You're not really sure how their teams are preparing for this. But knight to e2 and bishop to d5, just centralizing. We do see the exchange on e7 eventually, so Wesley decides now's a good time to go ahead and get rid of that double bishop pair for Fabiano Caruana. After the king's exchange, knight up here to d4, and then we see the knight's exchange here on d4. So we do have a, rook and one minor piece in game. Bishops usually do well if there's pawn chains on both sides of the board. Knights usually do better if there's just one pawn chain, because it can just control the entire thing right here. But both sides, fairly even on the board. White's really going to be looking to get all of his pawns and all of his pieces really on dark squares so that this light square bishop has less of an effect on the game. And black is going to really be looking to kind of break through with his rook. Right now it's playing defensive, but it doesn't have to anymore. There's not any more pressure, so he can play rook down here to h5, start to attack the pawn. He can play rook over here to a8, and really start to attack the queen, as we talked about, since he does have the pawn advantage. That's what both sides are going to be looking at in this position. Fabiano now plays bishop to e6, and then pawn up to c4. And this is somewhat of an interesting move. I think I prefer the pawn up here to f4 and just really start to attack on the king side of the board. Not worry so much about the queen side, because after pawn to c4, it's kind of undermined just by pawn to a4. Small choices here and there, my preference, but decides to go ahead and play pawn to c4, pawn a4, and then pawn up here to c5. So getting it out of the way of this bishop. This is a nice little square here on c5. Does limit some of the squares that the king can go to if this pawn is no longer here, and make sure that there's not too much that the pawns can do as far as pushing forward. It's going to stop that right away. We do see an exchange on here. This knight's kind of tied down, protecting this pawn from the bishop. So later on, he will want to make sure he plays pawn to b4. Pawn to g6 from black. This is another one of those where if we kind of study this game and figure out what options does he have right here. I think rook to a8 makes a lot of sense. It is the one open file where he can get behind enemy lines. The other open file is the d file, but he's not going to get past this knight right here. This knight can't come over here and block off the rook on the a file, so he can easily get behind enemy lines if he wants to. He could play rook down here to a3, put more pressure on this pawn on b3 if he wanted to. He could even come down to the second rank. Always good to have your rooks down on your second rank if you're black. So I think this is probably the more aggressive play from Fabiano Caruana, but plays a little bit safer in my opinion with pawn to g6, rook up to e4, now attacking this pawn on h4. Bishop to d5, attacking the rook over here to g4. Rook down here to h5. So taking a different approach here. Instead of worrying about being too aggressive over here, just wants to make sure he's solid over here on the king side of the board. Pawn to f4, just solidifying the pawn chain, pushing forward a little bit more on the king side. Rook back here, h8. Pawn to f5 seems pretty risky to start blowing up the pawn structure, because I think it is a very solid pawn structure. But after the pawn takes, a rook over here to f4, king d7, and then after the rook takes, a rook to g8. And this rook here on g8 and the bishop are both attacking this pawn on g2. So is forced to bring his rook back here to f2. And all of a sudden, Fabiano has a pretty strong attack. This rook is just looking down at this king that doesn't have too much protection. This king is more centralized. Towards the end game, you want to have your king more centralized, not at the back rank right here, not involved into the action, which is the position that Wesley sows in. So all in all, I think Black's probably come out of this feeling pretty good about the end game. Fabiano, rook to g5, attacking the pawn, and then king to h2. We see the rook take here on e5, knowing there's no way to hold on to that material. It is going to fall. And so now we see rook up here to f4, rook to g5, and then we see an attempt to trade off, and we do see an exchange, and then pawn takes here on g4. King here to e7, so now it's going to be about centralizing both of the kings. Pawn up here to g3, and the next move I think is pretty interesting. If Fabiano would have tried it, he played king to f6, and it's not what the game is about right now is not these pawns over here. He's going to be able to stop them if he wants to. It's all about making sure that his opponent's king can't get into the action, and so making it as hard as possible to do that, make the longest path for this king, I think is the way to go, which means I think pawn to h3 is pretty interesting, because now if the king takes, he's either going to have to come back around this way and waste a couple moves, or he's going to have to come around this way and waste a couple moves, and then Black can just kind of dominate the center of the board or start to attack on the queen side. He does have those options. But since we see king to f6, then all of a sudden pawn to h4, it's a little bit easier for this king to get involved into the action. White does have the benefit in this position also of being able to push a little bit easier with two passed pawns, or one passed pawn and a protection here on the g file. So not quite sure I like the king here to f6, but we'll continue with king to e5, centralizing, knight to f5, bishop takes here on b3, h5, and then king here to f6. And this is where I think Black had the biggest opportunity in the game. Instead of king to f6, Black has to worry about the pawn pushing forward up here to h7. He knows he's not going to be able to stop it on h8 because he doesn't have a dark square bishop, but h7 is kind of the critical square on the board right now. I really like pawn to f6, getting ready for bishop to g8, protecting the square here on h7. We know that this pawn's not going to be doing too much. If the pawn ever moves up here, it's just going to be taken right away from this pawn. Doesn't matter if it's recaptured. He's not worried about this pawn right here. And so, how does white continue right here? Maybe king to g3, get involved into the action. Bishop up here to g8, as we talked about. Knight to e7, attacking that bishop. Bishop h7. We could see some moves after the knight comes back. This is a really good position for Black, and there's not a lot of great ways for white to continue. He's not going to be able to hold on to these pawns. And then over on the king side of the board, I think or on the queen side of the board, he's going to have a really strong attack. But in the game, you can see how much different it is when he plays king to f6, because king to g3, and he just doesn't have as strong of attack. The king is now forced to come over here and play defensive, where I think the bishop would have already allowed him to do that, and he would have had a pawn pushed a little bit further up the board. Pawn to h6, king back here, g6 playing defense, pawn at g5, white just pushing more pawns up the board. A bishop to c2, attacking the knight, knight to d4. Bishop back here, b1, king f4, centralizing a little bit more. And now we see pawn comes up here to f6. We see an exchange on board, and then bishop on b1 is honing down, protecting the square here on h7. But there's just not much that Black has going on in this position right here. pawn to b6, and they decide that both sides don't really have a lot going on, so we do see some exchange on the board. There's no way for white to continue up more, so he decides, I'm going to go ahead and give up that pawn, and then after king to d5, pawn to c4, and we see a draw in the game. So all in all, two titans of the game battling it out. We do get a draw. I think they played a drawish opening. Both sides didn't take too many risks. I think if anyone was going to win this thing, it was Fabiano at the end of it. I think he had some chances to maybe have a little bit better end game, but both sides played it safe. At the end of the day, they did have a draw, played extremely well. No real mistakes on board, small little tweaks that I think they could have improved on. I think they'll be extremely happy. I think this was in both of their preparations. And anytime you play a top 3 player in the world and you can come away with that with a draw, knowing that you have so many other players that you can dominate, I think that's a moral victory for both of them. So hopefully you guys enjoyed round 3. We'll have another great game coming up in round 4. But thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.